Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video. Today we're going over 12 players that I think have huge upside in week number 7 of fantasy football. We're going to start this video off with a little combo of AJ Brown and Devonte Smith, both going up against the Miami Dolphins, of course. Coming off of that embarrassing loss to the New York Jets, Jalen Hurts was playing awful in that game. The play calling was horrible, some of the worst I've ever seen. They really need to get back on track, and it's going to be a very hard task in front of them with this red-hot Miami Dolphins team. This game has the highest projected over-under set at 51.5 points by Las Vegas, so obviously they think there's going to be a lot of scoring, and they have good reason to. These teams are number 1 and number 2 in total yards per game right now. Both the Eagles and the Dolphins have defenses ranking in the bottom 10 against the pass so far this year, and these teams have solid, loaded wide receiver options. Two of the best wide receiving cores in the entire league with Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle on the Dolphins side, and then AJ Brown and Devonte Smith on the Eagles side. Obviously, that leaves a ton of options to spread the ball around to. Not to mention, there's so many other, amazing players on both sides. It's not even funny. So far into this season, though, AJ Brown has been the clear number 1 wide receiver. After having that little chat with Jalen Hurts in week number 2 against the Minnesota Vikings, in the middle of that game, he finally started to get going, and he has not looked back since. He's averaged 24.85 PPR fantasy points since that game, while Devonte Smith has averaged just 8.15 fantasy points per game since that Minnesota Vikings game. Now, a lot of people are ready to give up on Devonte Smith, and I completely understand why you would be thinking that way, but I don't think that's a wise move, especially because you'd be trading him away at such a low value. This is probably one of his lowest values that he'll be at for the rest of the season. So do you really want to give up an elite option like that for basically nothing in return? Not basically nothing, but his value could be a lot higher at this point in time. Last week against the Jets, Devonte Smith saw the most targets since week number 1 with 11. He actually saw more targets in this game than AJ Brown did. Obviously, AJ Brown had a much better fantasy day, much better NFL game than Devonte Smith did, but it's good to see him getting more looks nonetheless. The Eagles are heading into a stretch of their schedule where they're going to have to put up points on points on points on points against some of the best offenses that you're going to see in the National Football League. So either they keep up with them or they get left in the dust and they are going to be an afterthought. But this week especially, I love both Devonte Smith and AJ Brown to have great weeks in a bounce-back game. They really need a win, and you better believe that they're going to be doing everything in their power to beat this Dolphins team. Next up is Rashee Rice against the Los Angeles Chargers. One of these weeks, we are going to see Rashee Rice really break out and solidify himself as the number 1 wide receiver in Kansas City. I really do have a good feeling about it this week. I think it could really happen this week. The Chargers are ranking 31st against the pass this season so far. The over-under in this game is set to 47.5 points. So once again, Vegas is expecting a lot of points to be scored in this one, and Rashee Rice has been trending in the right direction, along with getting very high praise from both Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes these past couple of weeks here. He's ranking 2nd in receptions, targets, yards, touchdowns, and red zone targets, all only behind Travis Kelce on this team right now, which is of course expected at this point in the season. Travis Kelce is going to be that number 1 option for the rest of the year. Patrick Mahomes and Kelce just have that connection that they've been growing year after year after year that they've been on the same team. Rashee Rice hasn't had that experience yet. So the only thing that I really see holding Rashee Rice back at the moment is his playing time. Okay, he hasn't played on more than 51% of snaps in any game so far this season, and he's still putting up good numbers. I do trust that the Chiefs are going to eventually realize what they have in Rashee Rice and play him a bit more, and I think this is a great week to do so against a struggling Chargers defense. Next up, we have Josh Jacobs going up against the Chicago Bears. Josh Jacobs has certainly been underwhelming, to say the least, this season in terms of where he was drafted in fantasy football, currently sitting right outside the top 10 running backs in the league and has just one game scoring over 20 PPR fantasy points so far this year. That is nothing like Jacobs, or the Jacobs that we saw last year. The really gross part so far about Josh Jacobs this season is the yards per carry, which is sitting at 2.9 yards. That wouldn't be horrible, except for the fact that he has 107 attempts and is still averaging that low of a yards per carry. That's definitely concerning. So he is still seeing a massive workload. That's not the part we're worried about. It is the efficiency that he's playing at right now. But the reason that Josh Jacobs is still a solid option in fantasy any given week is, of course, his constant work in the passing game in this Las Vegas Raiders offense. He's averaging over 5 targets per game and around 35 receiving yards per game. This week, he faces a Bears team that is ranking 28th against the run. So obviously a great matchup for him. Also, the Bears just lost Justin Fields, who for who knows how many weeks. So he's at least going to be out this game, which means they're going to have Tyson Bagent in at quarterback. Most likely, the scenario that's going to play out is that Bagent struggles a bit in this one and the Raiders are on the field and they dominate the time of possession. This should give Jacobs the opportunities that he needs to succeed in fantasy. Another aspect working in his favor is that Jimmy G is also going to be out in this matchup, most likely. So it's either going to be Brian Hoyer or Aiden O'Connell. So their quarterback might struggle as well, giving Jacobs more attempts in this game. Next up is Kenneth Walker going up against the Arizona Cardinals. Walker has been proving that he is more than a reliable running back option right now in fantasy football. Although his average yards per carry normally isn't that high, he has such a high potential to break a couple runs on a game-to-game basis. His big playability will more than make up for those 1 to 2 yard runs that he normally gets. So far into this season, he's averaging 18.3 PPR fantasy points per week, and his playing time concerns compared to Zach Charbonnet, that is, are just non-existent anymore. In week number 6, Walker played on 76.7% of snaps, while Charbonnet only saw 23.2% of snaps. Walker gets almost every carry in this offense. I will say Charbonnet does see a good chunk of passing work, but it's nothing compared to Kenneth Walker's workload on a weekly basis. This week, they face the Arizona Cardinals, who are ranking 30th against the run. And regardless of the game script, whether they're losing, whether they're winning by a ton, Walker is going to get the work that he needs to be a solid fantasy option in this one. Next up, we got Jaleel McLaughlin going up against the Green Bay Packers. There's a reason that McLaughlin is on this list over Javonte Williams and Samaje Perine for high upside, because he looks like the clear best running back in this backfield, at least to me. Let me know if I'm crazy. Do you guys think that McLaughlin looks better than Javonte and Perine? Because I know I can't be the only one. The problem right now is that we don't know if he's going to get enough playing time to really break out and have a huge week just yet. Now, this past week when Javonte Williams came back from his injury, this was his first game back from injury, McLaughlin actually outsnapped both Williams and Perine, but I don't really know if that's going to continue into week 7, because that could just be a precautionary measure, having Javonte start behind McLaughlin just because it was his first game back. So that's the risk to reward that you're thinking about when you are playing Jaleel McLaughlin in this upcoming week against the Green Bay Packers. However, this is a great matchup because the Packers are currently ranking 29th in stopping the run. The other red flag in my eyes is the Broncos as a whole are just not a good team. They really aren't. But in this case, if they actually can show up and put up a fight in this game against the Packers, McLaughlin is a great guy to bet on, right? He's great at pass catching, has that explosive upside in the run game. Why not take a shot on McLaughlin? Next up, we got Devonte Adams going up against the Chicago Bears. In my eyes, I can only see this happening or playing out in one way. All right, Devonte Adams can only be held quiet for so long. Despite Adams struggling for 2 weeks straight now he's going to go up against a Bears team who has really struggled to get things going these past couple of weeks. His target share past 2 games has been the real issue, though. He's only seen an average of 4.5 targets per game, which is not anything like the Devonte Adams that we are used to seeing. These 2 games were against the Packers and the Patriots. In the Packers game, Jair Alexander is a great cornerback. Okay, he had a rough game there. And then Bill Belichick on the other side of the things in that Patriots game, he is known to stop the number 1 options on opposing teams. That's what he is a great coach for, okay? So if he struggles in these next 2 games against the Chicago Bears and the Detroit Lions, I think we're talking about a whole different issue, and that quarterback issue is definitely being brought into play because, I'd rather have Jimmy Garoppolo throwing to me than Brian Hoyer or Aiden O'Connell. But if they're going to force feed the ball, hopefully in these next couple of games to Devonte Adams, then, he should perform well in fantasy. I think they really need to make it a point to get him the ball if they plan on winning these next couple of games. Next up, we got Jaylen Waddle going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. We already talked about earlier about this Eagles and Dolphins matchup being the highest projected total of the week at 51.5 points. The Dolphins are on fire currently, and the Eagles have a bottom 5 pass defense in the league right now. Even Garrett Wilson last week torched the Eagles defense, which a lot of people were saying, that's a bad play. Do not play Garrett Wilson against the Eagles. Well, Darius Slay was out, I believe it was, and they couldn't stop anything. They could not stop anything. Garrett Wilson had a great day in that matchup. Now, I could take the easy road here and say that Tyreek Hill is going to have a great day, which I also think he will, but he's not on this list because I don't put people like Tyreek Hill, Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson, whatever the case may be when he was healthy on these types of lists because you have to play those guys every single week, no matter what. So far this year, you might be thinking Jaylen Waddle has been quite the letdown, and that is somewhat true because he was drafted at his peak value. But he has scored over 10 PPR fantasy points in 4 out of 5 total games so far, coming off his best week of the year against Carolina, scoring 18.1 PPR fantasy points. He might finally be starting to warm up. Let's hope so, at least. And you better believe this matchup means a ton to both the Eagles and the Dolphins, like I said earlier. So both are going to put up a huge fight in this one. Waddle is going to be a key piece helping the Dolphins do just that. If they stand any chance of winning, Waddle will be involved in this matchup. Next up, we got Puka Nacua going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. We finally saw Cooper Kupp steal the show in last week's game against the Arizona Cardinals, and Puka was left in the dust with just 4 catches for 26 yards on 7 targets. Do I think Puka is all of a sudden worthless in fantasy? You should be hitting the panic button on him. Absolutely not. He is an extremely talented and efficient player, and Stafford is going to need him throughout the rest of this season. That being said, he is going to have his up and down weeks throughout the course of the year, especially when the offense isn't clicking like normal. In that game against the Arizona Cardinals, going into halftime, the Rams only put up 6 points. Kyren Williams, I think it was, had 0.5 fantasy points heading into half. He ended the game with 158 yards rushing and a touchdown. All right, so that just shows how fast things can change over the course of a half of football. And Puka just unfortunately did not get involved too much in this game. There's going to be much better days ahead for Puka Nacua and this Rams offense, especially in this upcoming week. I do expect him to be a lot more involved against a Pittsburgh Steelers team who is ranked 29th against the pass so far this season. I don't know if I can really say the same for Tutu Atwell, though. I think he is going to end up being the odd man out in this offense. I think Cooper Kupp, obviously, Puka Nacua, and then Kyren Williams are all going to be really solid options for this Rams team in terms of fantasy football. But Tutu Atwell, I don't know. He might get left behind it a little bit. It's sad to say, but, it's the truth. Next up, we have Brandon Aiyuk going up against the Minnesota Vikings. This 49ers team is kind of a mess right now in terms of the health on the offensive end, at least. But with everything happening, with Deebo Samuel going down last game, with Christian McCaffrey exiting the game in the middle, they still almost found a way to beat the Cleveland Browns, who have a great defense on the road last week. McCaffrey's banged up. They still don't know if he's going to play on Monday. And the same thing is true with Deebo, as we just talked about. Not saying either of these guys are going to miss this upcoming Sunday for sure, but if they do, then Aiyuk is for sure the number 1 option in their absence. So far this season, Aiyuk is averaging 16.5 PPR fantasy points, but the really nice thing about this situation is that Aiyuk's targets have increased since last season. Last year, he averaged right around 6.7 targets per game, and so far this year, he's at 7.4 targets per game. And that is taken into consideration that in week number 2, he wasn't himself due to a shoulder injury. Week number 5 against Dallas was a complete blowout, and the starters didn't even play nearly as much as they would normally in the second half of that game. And this past week, they played one of the toughest defenses in football, and he had no other options to help him out on offense, basically. The 49ers schedule going into the rest of the year gets so much more friendly, starting with this game against the Minnesota Vikings, who is currently ranking 30th against the pass. After that first 49ers loss, Brock Purdy is going to look for a bounce-back game, and Aiyuk should be his number 1 target heading into this next week. Next up, we got Christian Watson going up against the Denver Broncos. Watson is slowly getting back to normal after missing the first few weeks due to that hamstring injury. Week number 5, he was back to his normal snap count, right up there with Romeo Doubs, and he led the team in not only receiving yards, but also targets as well. This was a terrible, I mean terrible game for Jordan Love. He struggled a ton. He was only able to complete 16 passes out of 30 attempts, but on a weekly basis, obviously, he's going to play better than that. Christian Watson is the #1 wide receiver in Green Bay, and although they might not be the best team in the world right now, they're also very far from being the worst. This week, the Broncos should provide a much more favorable matchup for the Packers than last week, and they should be able to get back on track. This same thing could also be said about Romeo Doubs, but I feel much more confident if I had to pick one of these guys. Christian Watson is clearly the guy I want in this offense. And last but not least, I want to put Roschon Johnson on this list against the Las Vegas Raiders. I'm putting Roschon last on this list because for some reason, he still hasn't been cleared from concussion protocol as of Wednesday night. This is a great situation that he's being put in if he ends up playing. That concussion happened almost 2 weeks ago, and the fact that he hasn't cleared it as of Wednesday is a little bit concerning. But so far into this season, Johnson is averaging 4.9 yards per carry when he's healthy. He was also involved a good amount in the passing game, even when Khalil Herbert was not on IR, especially in week #1. He caught 6 passes for 35 yards in that game. That's when the hype for Roschon Johnson was rising like crazy, and for good reason. But since then, he hasn't really gotten the opportunities to prove himself and prove that he has what it takes to be a #1 running back in this league right now. This game against the Raiders should give him exactly that chance to do so, although he's going to be without Justin Fields and have Tyson Bagent as his quarterback. So it's a little bit worrisome, but hopefully he checks the ball down a good amount to Roschon Johnson. Also, I was looking at the ESPN fantasy app, I think it was the other day, and I saw someone talking about wanting to play Dante Foreman over Roschon Johnson if they're both healthy this week. That makes no sense to me at all. I don't know why you would ever do that, but we had an analyst talking about that. I don't know. Let me know if I'm crazy in the comment section down below. Who are you starting in this backfield if both Roschon Johnson and Dante Foreman are healthy? Let me know. Also, drop a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. And also, we just created a new Twitter. By the way, I will link it in the pinned comment and also the description below if you want to go check it out and, support me further over on Twitter. Anyways, have a great rest of your day and good luck in week #7, guys. Peace.